So my test model were insulin-secreting cells that were incubated, and this is all in a test tube, incubated in high nutrient conditions, and their baseline insulin was very high, so maybe 5 or 6 times normal. And then I got a whole collection of drugs that included things that have been found in our food supply that I could find on all these labels. So I tested them to ask, do any of these things have any effect on insulin secretion compared to the high nutrient environment? And lo and behold, 10% of them did it. So so I started with the first 3, and one of them was monoleoglycerol, which you will find, as I say, in everything. Another one was iron, which is added to fortify and make things supposedly healthier. The third one was saccharin. And all 3 of them cause insulin secretion without any glucose.
Welcome back to Demystify Sci. Today we are digging deep with Dr. Barbara Corkey on obesogens. We've been trying to figure out for a little while now about what's wrong with our food supply, because I think that it's pretty apparent that since the 1970s, a ton of diseases have been increasing. We have a massive increase in autism. We have large increases in young people with colon cancer, with reproductive cancers in both genders. I think pancreatic cancer too. I was looking at this recently. And obviously obesity. And obesity is a really interesting topic because for a lot of people, this ends up being a moral calculus. It's like, well, you're fat because you're a bad person. And if you just ate less, then you wouldn't be fat and the world would work out. And Dr. Corkey's argument is that A, that's really inhumane. B, that is actually something that used to be the case for hypertension. So 50, 60 years ago, when hypertension started to become really widespread, she's like, we treated hypertension as being a problem with the person. Somebody was doing something wrong, and so they had hypertension.
Well, they're neurotic, they're worried people.
And so if you just calm down, you wouldn't have hypertension, which surely there's a little bit of a component of that, but we've discovered that there's massive genetic and environmental components that need to be treated in order to actually help people. And so...
and C, it doesn't seem to matter how much you eat for a lot of us. The weight stays the same. You can tip it, I think the statistic she gives is to increase 10% of your body weight, it takes something like 700 additional calories. There's a really solid set point. And so what else could be going on? That's really what this discussion is about. What is it that we can actually change in order to, in some sense, chase down this obesity epidemic, which seems to be threatening all areas of healthcare, from cancer to diabetes and everything in between, perhaps even behavioral mood disorders, everything in between. This seems to be something that's cropped up in the last 50 years. You look at pictures, people on the beach from 70 years ago, they don't look like our population today. And so something's changed, and it doesn't seem like it was the addition of, it doesn't seem like fats solved it, right? So for our parents' generation, it was all Crisco, margarine. That didn't work. So what's going on? And Barbara doesn't even think that it's necessarily sugar or carbs by themselves. It's what goes into making those products that perhaps have carbs, what goes into the processing of the flour that makes the bread. So there's a whole layer underneath here. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of people working on this nuanced detail. It seems like there's hundreds of chemicals that are at play. And of course, dealing with everything all at once is next to impossible. So next generation is going to have to really hone down a few of these that can be really tackled and chased out of the food supply, because it seems like this problem isn't going away.
Definitely. And we have a conversation that we've had with Stephanie Seneff about the influence of glyphosate on the same sort of diseases and disorders. And so this is part of a larger series where we're trying to figure out what is it in the environment that's causing so many problems for everyone across the board in a way that appears to travel with increases in GDP, with the presence of Monsanto, with the presence of processed foods that are emanating into the remaining countries in the world that don't yet have massive problems with cancer and obesity. And so And still, and so, and so, and so. And so this is the first conversation of many, and we hope that you enjoy it.
Remember, this project's entirely crowdfunded, and we want to keep it that way. So please come over and check out our Patreon page. It's actually a really amazing inner community. We get together once a week over Zoom, hang out, discuss what needs to be investigated in the world, what we can do better on the show, and really just hang out and tear apart ideas that all of us share as interests. So check out our Patreon page. It allows us to keep all of the ads and, pills and garbage that people sell to fund their podcasts completely out of our house. And like I said, we're going to keep it that way, and we need your help. So come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and give us, the tiniest piece of your paycheck, a couple dollars a month. It will really help power this project.
And in the meantime, enjoy our conversation with Dr. Barbara Corkey, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
What are we doing this for?
That's a good question.
Well, for our own curiosity. We are really curious about understanding obesity better, understanding these giant epidemics as they sweep through the population.
Myths about diet.
Myths about diet. You have some pretty not intuitive conclusions, like you about calories especially, that I want to be able to dig into.
Body weight set points.
Yeah, body weight set points. And so Shiloh had a really good question that he wanted to start with. So maybe you could lead us into it.
Well, I was just thinking that in my own lifetime, my own little life, I've seen so many dietary fads come and go. When I was a kid, fat was the demon, right? So everything was non-fat, and people were, you had non-fat butter substitutes, Crisco,
Right.
like all this
Exactly.
bizarre stuff that people, and it seems like that has come and gone. But that myth
Thank
still
God.
persists, I think, with the older generation, like my parents. They're still, eating margarine and
All my colleagues, people my age, think that it's very bad to have a high-fat meal. And unfortunately, so much of what we've learned is correlational without regard to the fact that correlation and causation are not necessarily linked in the way that people try to do it. So increased fat in our environment, in our diet, in our food supplies did correlate with the increase in obesity. So our brilliant government and my brilliant colleagues concluded that fat was the cause because of that correlation. And so the government actually had a big role in encouraging people to eat less fat. And to this very day, most physicians encourage people, because that's what they learned in medical school. And if you look at the curve, the decrease in fat consumption correlates with the increase in obesity. So if you want to play correlation games, cutting fat is the reason why we became obese. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's correct. I'm saying in both cases, it's faulty reasoning. But there is no evidence, not a shred, that fat causes obesity.
To what extent did I've heard some rumors about the sugar industry having had a hand in this as well, or perhaps grains and so forth. Like, was there some sort of political battle behind the scenes that you're aware of regarding fat versus carbs at the time, or?
Whatever I've heard is hearsay. I have no evidence for who's responsible for what. But what I do know is that our government subsidizes industries, for example, that supply us with high fructose corn syrup, wheat, and bread, and those things that people consumed instead of fat. Because the bottom line is we all naturally eat about 20% protein in our diet. I mean, this is almost instinctive. We need that to make, to regrow our cells and to repair the body parts and so forth. The other 80%, now these are rough numbers and it's not meant to be precise, but the other 80% is either carb or fat. There's no other choice. So a low fat diet is a high carb diet, and a high fat diet is a low carb diet, and so on and so forth. So that by encouraging the industries that are responsible for a lot of the, let's say, high fructose corn syrup, in a way, the government is promoting that, but I don't think that was their intention. I think the real intention of all this fast food and well-preserved food that will last forever and ever on your shelf, which wasn't the case when I was a kid, has to do with treating starvation and food deprivation. And whereas, I don't know, several decades ago, certainly in the last century, the biggest world health problem was starvation, failure to thrive, childhood diseases. And the efforts that have also led to this screwed up diet that we have and the thousands of new additives has solved that problem. And now the biggest health problem is obesity. So, yeah, it's just, you can't be too simplistic about it. It's not all bad. And, I think I'd rather have children thrive and be fat than die in infancy. So I think we need to really look at it in a very thoughtful manner. And yes, we have caused this problem, and no, we do not know precisely how and why.
Mm. Do you think that?
And certainly the government has played a major role in promoting behaviors that have promoted obesity.
And you think
Although
just
that
through
was never their goal.
just through dietary guidelines?
Not just through dietary guidelines, but also by supporting industries that, any industries that are participants, whether intentional or not. So it's not dead simple. You can't say, oh, those are the bad guys. And yes, the big food industries that make a huge fortune off of all the junk food that people need to eat when they're watching a football game. They don't want it to go away. They don't want their profit to go away. But, if they did, they'd be idiots.
They wouldn't be around for very long, that's for sure.
Exactly. They wouldn't be a problem for us at all.
So do you think that this ranks among the top food myths that we've grown up with? Are there other myths about diet that you've seen over your time studying these things?
Well, that's a funny story. I've just done a series of 5 lectures at the retirement community where I'm living right now. And these are myths about obesity. And, there are other myths. The one that I have the most trouble with is the lack of recognition that obesity is a disease and the blaming the people who are obese for bad behavior as the cause of the disease.
Interesting.
Now, we did the same thing, believe it or not, in the 1940s with hypertension and a little bit later on with ulcers. It was, neurotic personalities that led to those diseases. And if people could just sort of calm down and take it easy, they wouldn't have ulcers or hypertension. And of course, nobody would say anything like that. That's stupid today. And I think there'll come a time when nobody will blame individuals for their obesity because we'll eventually learn what the real cause is and hopefully remove it. In fact, there are accidental treatments now that are curing obesity. And even now we don't know why. So
you're
for
thinking
example,
about the GLP-1 agonists?
Yeah, they were developed to treat diabetes because they stimulate insulin secretion. They're very potent and they're secreted in the gut when you eat. They go into the bloodstream and they stimulate insulin secretion. And they were developed for diabetics for that very reason. And lo and behold, what they found was Instead, they caused weight loss. So, and now if you infuse insulin into a person or an animal, they will become obese. So insulin does not, stimulating insulin secretion does not cause weight loss. It's been well documented to do exactly the opposite. So this was, nobody expected it. It was not why it was developed. And of course, everybody was overjoyed because the combination, or whatever it did, it almost eliminated diabetes or any of the characteristics of diabetes in individuals who took the drug. So,
is there any sense of why it's also causing weight loss?
well, I think, as soon as it happened, scientists began delving into this. And there's much more work now going on looking at the various gut hormone receptors in the brain. And they are there. And that is part of why I think that one of the myths is that you control your own weight. If you're good and you eat healthy food, you're going to be lean and gorgeous, right? Wrong. All
There
through
has to be
history.
there has to be some fraction of that is true, though, right? Because to some extent, people can control. Because I see people
Yeah.
who will eat clean for a little while, and it dramatically changes their physiology, and then they can't hold on to it, and then they go back to an old diet, and then everything collapses again.
That's the part that I don't agree with. They don't go back to their old diet necessarily. Or there's a toxic substance, an obesogen, in the old diet. It's not that they're eating carbs or fat or chips. If they grew the potatoes in their backyard and they made the chips in their own device, and those chips only lasted for a couple of hours before they got soggy. I don't know if you've ever deep fried potatoes, but those crispy chips do not last very long. But the ones you buy in the store last forever. Now, what could possibly explain that? And so it's not that they made a bad choice going back to eating potato chips. It's perhaps something in those chips that hasn't been identified or called out that is responsible for the effects, the regain of the weight. And part of that is that, in our family, my husband had diabetes. So did my daughter. Neither of them have it now. And I'm an avid cook. I cook all my meals and always have done this, and I have a lot of fun doing it. In fact, I even have a cookbook that's on the online, free for anyone who wants it, and it's focused on improving metabolic health in people with metabolic disease. And so the big part of that was making everything from scratch. So there are no ingredients that I never use, but I buy vegetables and prepare them myself. I don't buy anything already prepared. So if you go, to buy meat, some of them are marinated in some delicious sounding things. Don't go anywhere near that. I don't. It is my choice. Doing just that alone, both and relatively low carb, because most carbohydrates are highly processed, not because carbohydrates are bad, but because it's almost impossible to get carbohydrates except in fruits, really, that isn't processed. The flour that the bread is made of, never mind all the other things that are in there to preserve it, looks nothing like the wheat that grew in a field somewhere. So a lot of stuff has happened to that plant before it arrives in your bread. And so that's why the diet is low carb, not because I think that carbs per se are particularly bad, but they're very processed. And in fact, most of the middle aisles that you go in when you go shopping are high carb. And where they have also high fat, the fats in there are nothing that you'd ever use at home for the most part. So we stopped doing that. And the consequence was my husband and I each lost 40 pounds without ever curtailing our food intake in any way. And I guess my daughter, I don't remember how much she lost, but neither one of them has diabetes anymore. It's gone. And no medications, nothing. It was, just that simple. And I think it's becoming more and more obvious in practice that if that kind of a dietary recommendation, if somebody follows it, can be a cure at some stage when people still have beta cell pancreas function remaining. So
that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Have you had any luck at tracking down the individual molecules or additives or processes that can? I think most people have no clue that the wheat isn't the only piece of the puzzle, right? Or like what goes into making flour that's harmful?
I should have brought a label along with me, but go to the store and look at something that you think you could simply make with, let's say, a bread you can make with 3 ingredients at home, in theory. Now that bread will not last much longer than after it comes out of the oven. It will be delicious for a little bit, and then it will get hard and stale. There are, in addition to the wheat flour, which has been processed, and we don't know how, because that's not really well described, there are a lot of preservatives of various sorts added. And one of them is one group of things are mono and diglycerides, which are natural compounds your body produces, and it's part of the way you form triglycerides. And so it's one of the steps in that natural process. So it's not a totally alien ingredient, but almost every single dairy product and bread and things that have a long shelf life have contained these things. So I decided I was going to solve the problem when I had my lab, and I set up a screen using insulin secreting beta cells. And the principle was that most people who are obese have high fasting insulin. So their basal insulin levels are very, very elevated. And I said at the beginning that if you elevate insulin, it causes fat storage. That's one of its main jobs, is to store fat. And it also lowers blood sugar. So if you're making too much insulin, you're going to have low blood sugar unless some compensation takes place, which is insulin resistance, which most physicians view insulin resistance as the cause of diabetes. And I think it's the consequence of high insulin. And I think it's the high insulin that stimulates fat storage. Okay, so my test model were insulin secreting cells that were incubated, and this is all in a test tube, incubated in high nutrient conditions, and their baseline insulin was very high. So maybe 5 or 6 times normal. And then I got a whole collection of drugs that included things that have been found in our food supply that I could find on all these labels, or things that have been fortified, like iron. We get a lot of iron fortification in many of our foods, which can be very good. It's not all bad. But so I tested them to ask, do any of these things have any effect on insulin secretion compared to the high nutrient environment? And lo and behold, the most disappointing thing is we set up to test about 100 compounds in the first round. 10% of them did it. I thought, oh my God, this is 10% of 100. There are over 4,000. I am not a machine. I don't have a company. I have a small lab with, a few people working there. And then each thing that had an effect, you have to go back and do a dose response. And then ultimately you have to take blood from people and find out what levels actually exist, because it could be very effective at a dose that was never ever seen in a human. So there's a lot of work to show that this finding actually is an important one in terms of understanding the disease. So so I started with the first three, and one of them was monoleoglycerol, which you will find, as I say, in everything. Another one was iron, which is added to fortify and make things supposedly healthier. The third one was saccharin. And all three of them cause insulin secretion without any glucose.
Is there something
And
special about that iron that's added, or what's going on there?
I added it bound to ferritin, which is the way it normally exists in the blood. And again, I'm not saying this is not evidence that this is what's happening in people. It's a step. It's a worthwhile question to follow up on.
So basically what you're saying is that normally you would have glucose in the system. The glucose would cause the cells to secrete insulin, and inside the body, the insulin is acting to increase fat storage and to decrease blood sugar. And so now you're doing this experiment and you're adding things that aren't sugars, but you're getting the cells to release insulin to the same level as in the presence of nutrients?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And, the limited amount of testing that I did with monoglyceride, for example, was I had a very nice dose response over a range. Again, I don't know what we need to worry about. It's published. So, hopefully somebody will be able to follow it. And the screening is not that difficult. And I even found out what the mechanism was. Oh, how did those things that seem so very different do it? And the answer is that the molecule that is inferred when people say inflammation is induced by those compounds, or was in this test system. And
like a cytokine or something? Or?
No, well, it's produced by cytokines. It's reactive oxygen.
Ah, that's right.
It's a natural product. It's something that as mitochondria produce reactive oxygen all the time, particularly in the resting state. And it turns out to be an important signal. If you prevent it from happening, beta cells won't secrete insulin. So my model is that it's there. It's produced when there's more than enough fuel, when the energy needs have been met and there's still fuel around, it's produced. And that's a really good signal to, okay, now store. The excess nutrient needs storage. And so I think that's that's my model, let's say, of why they do what they do and how they do it. And it may or may not be, it's not the Bible, but it's a terrific starting point for investigating things like this. And it's something we could easily do in people or in test tubes.
And so basically there's these molecules that induce the over-nutrified state, even in the absence of being over-nutrified.
Yes, they send a false signal that there's too much nutrition around and you need to store. Exactly right. And if you store glucose when there's not too much around, the brain says, food, give me food. I'm going to faint. I'm not getting enough glucose. So it's a very good reaction. It's the way the body is behaving beautifully. Quite effective.
So this is a little tricky because it's not like you've come up with one silver bullet that you're pointing to. You seem to imply that in this screen it was 10% of compounds. Did you ever finish?
Outrageous.
Did you finish the 4,000 compound screen?
Are you kidding? I had a lab with about 5 people in it, and we're not. I mean, if you worked for a drug company, they have set up high throughput screening cores that go through thousands of compounds in a day. We were doing this, manually, one drop at a time. We didn't have the setup, and it it's what I would recommend doing. I mean, that is the right way to do it, obviously. And the other thing that I've recommended is that we need a library of all of the junk that's gotten into our food supply and into our environment in general, because some of this stuff could be breathed in, and we just don't know. But those chemicals can be known, and there are environmental groups that are identifying and looking at those kinds of things. And if there was a library of 10,000 compounds, as there is for other screening processes, you just buy the library and set up test systems. And you could do it I did it in beta cells, but you could do it in almost any cell. And if the mechanism is what I said, if it's producing this ROS, you just generate it. You have cells that grow easily, measure ROS production. What increases ROS? And if it increases ROS, then let's have a look at it in more detail and see whether or not it's available in concentrations that could have this effect, and whether it's present in the circulation of individuals who are becoming obese.
I mean, it's also complicated by the mixture of these compounds that's actually in the food supply, right? Because you pull open.
Oh, and again, you've just reached in the second level of complication, and that is that, all right, if each one alone may or may not do something, what about when we combine them? And there are certain things that are very frequently combined. And so, yeah, what happens when we combine them? And
Go ahead.
Another way you could go about it is to, do mass spec analysis of the blood supply if someone's in the process of becoming obese, because it's possible to become obese and then stabilize, and it's the cause may no longer be present.
I'm really looking forward to the affordable mass spec revolution, because I'm always wandering around outside, and I'm obsessed with water quality. And I dream of being able to take a water sample from the creek nearby when it looks kind of weird, and just be able to run it and see what's in it. Totally. But it's just not. We're close. I think we're close, because you can they sell genome sequencers now that you can plug into your cell phone, and it's basically a lab on a chip. And so you can do you have to do a bunch of stuff before then, but it actually will do it. So I think we're close.
But you have to have the motivation. And if you already know the answer, if you know the reason for the obesity epidemic is just because people have no self-control and they're bad, then why spend the money? Mass spec is not a cheap operation. Neither is high throughput screening, for that matter. So there has to be a motivation. And if you look at the dollars spent on, for example, cancer research, and the dollars spent on obesity research, and you look at the number of people affected by cancer and the number of people affected by metabolic disease, at one point when I did do the calculation, looking at the United States government spending, we were spending less than $1 a person to study obesity. And I think it was it wasn't just cancer, it was AIDS, $2,000 per person to study AIDS. And guess which one got medications that were useful treatments for the disease? And that I think that we don't find answers without investing in the research. Or
it seems like there should be
to accidentally make a drug like the GLP-1 receptor agonist.
It seems like there should be some overlap too. There's increasing evidence that cancer is, at least in some large part, a metabolic disease as well. And so it seems like a lot of these same compounds would probably play into a cancer-ready state, let's say. I mean, curing cancer is very, very difficult, but preventing it might be something that we could look forward to in the future.
Well, I think that's true in general. I think what we need to do is prevent the next generation from having all these metabolic problems. Because even if we let's say I'm right about the cause, and I'm sure my little model is too simplistic, but it's a reasonable start. We don't know that the damage that's been done is reversible, because we started out by saying, one of the myths is that you are what you eat, and that is not correct. We know that from Mother Nature. We've known it for generations. It absolutely is not the answer.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Can you elaborate on why that's not the answer?
So if look into the wild, have you ever been on safari?
Mm-mm. I go into the woods a lot, though.
We spend a lot of time in the woods. We live in Oregon, so we have plenty of safari.
We go on deer. We go on deer and trout safari.
Okay, no matter how much food the deer and the trout have available, they do not suffer from obesity. No matter how much food the lion has available, and they can catch anything they want, they do not suffer from obesity. Animals, even pet animals that are not fed commercial food, do not develop obesity. You can always tell somebody whose little dog gets table scraps, because they're very chubby.
We actually stopped feeding our cat dry food, and she just got super svelte and energetic, and we only feed her very, very expensive meat now. Painfully expensive meat.
I do the same thing. I have a standard poodle. We had to put one down this year who was very old. But we have two standard poodles who get better food than we do, I think, and never have gotten a drop of anything from the table, because I think it's offensive when people come to dinner and the dog is aggravating them. And they're both slender. They've always maintained exactly the same weight. We did the same thing as humans prior to the 1960s and 70s. There were children growing up. I can remember as a kid, nobody was obese. There were no fat children. And now that's the fastest growing obese population. So something is very different, and it is not in human nature. So when I was a kid, my mother made desserts. We all, came home from school, we wanted a snack. And we were always given enough to satisfy our desire to eat. And some mothers made more cookies and candies, and we all had junk in our lunch boxes. None of this led to any problems with weight management. There were always a couple of kids, but then if you looked at their parents and their siblings, they were all fat. Everyone in the family was fat. So you know that there was a genetic component here. But for the rest of the world, there wasn't such a thing. Now, do you think we were all good then? And our parents were all good then? That's crazy. You'd have to be, how can you think that way? And then to say that our junk food is now much tastier, it isn't true. A homemade cake or pie is every bit as good as any kind of junk you can buy.
But it's easier
to get hold of. When you're a kid, any food you want is easy to get hold of, because your mother gives it to you.
Depending. I mean, like, I grew up, we never had soda pop in the house. We never had...
No, we didn't either.
Right? And so...
Okay. There you go.
I had friends who did, though. Like, my buddy Nate, we'd go over and drink his soda because his parents were the only ones who'd buy it. But they weren't obese either, which is strange, actually.
So,
I mean, their teeth are falling out.
Like, there must be a genetic component in the other direction, because, like, we were talking before we sat down, where, like, Shiloh has a metabolic set point. Like,
he's a what?
So Shiloh has a metabolic set point of a specific weight.
Yeah, I can't gain weight for the life of me. It's like I can gain it for maybe a week or something. I'll just eating until I'm uncomfortable all the time.
Right.
But I'm still working out the same every day. Trying to push it as much as possible, but I just can't. Like, I'm just stuck right there at 165.
But he's from a family of bird people.
Yeah. Most people are at a set point most of the time. whether you're thin or whether you're obese, and whether you're watching your food and whether you're not. However, if you eat the same way all the time, or within a family, let's say, some people will be thin, some people will be fat. When you're young, you're more likely to be thin. There is always a propensity to gain weight with age, and there always has been. And I actually think that's perhaps protective. But in any event, most people are stable. I've talked to primary care physicians who, among the few valuable things they do every time you come into the office is weigh you. And so they see how people are trending over time. And I said, the people who are suffering from obesity, are they going up step every time they come? No, he says they don't. They go on, they're stable for years, and then they go up 5 pounds. And then they're stable and they go up 10 pounds. And even, people who are obese, and if you think of the people who are overweight, most of them are staying at that overweight. So it's not like weight is going up and down all over the place. Your set point is the way we're designed. It's the way the deer and the lion and so forth, we're all designed this way, to have a certain percentage of fat, a certain amount of body weight. And you don't have to do anything except have enough and have the essential nutrients to get there. So, for example, if you overeat, let's say at Thanksgiving time, and which many people do, by the end of that meal, everyone is hot.
Mm.
Your body is wasting energy. All these sensors, wherever they may be, have decided that there's enough fuel and enough stores. And so now you're producing heat. So there are 3 variables, and we forget this middle one, which you have in spades, because you can't gain weight. But that's because your body works properly. It has the ability, if you overeat, to waste energy. And this has been proven, and despite the fact that nobody recognizes this, by a guy called Rudy Leibel at Columbia in New York. If he took a group of people and he did a crossover study, and so half of them were designed to lose 10% of their body weight, and I may not get this exactly right, but it's essentially, in principle, correct, and the other half to gain 10%. And so the first thing he did was determine how many calories they required to maintain the weight they were at. So they were in hospital and monitored carefully. Then he increased or decreased the nutrition by, let's say, 10%. Absolutely nothing happened to any of them. None of them lost weight and none of them gained weight. So you can vary your intake, at least over this period, which is reasonably short, without any effect at all, because your body compensates by becoming more efficient or less efficient. You burn a little more or you save a little more. And he calculated how many calories, say their normal daily requirement was like 2,000 calories. They required something like 700 calories extra in order to gain 10%. And they had to cut by, 3 times more than they predicted in order to lose any weight. And this is consistent with anyone who's ever gone on a diet or tried to gain weight. You don't. You compensate and the degree to which we can compensate may vary, but all creatures have this capacity. Most people have you don't eat exactly the same amount every day. No one has ever done that. And, and anyone who's ever tried to diet has always noticed that it takes much bigger cuts than you would predict to cause any weight loss. So this is a regulated variable. It's like body temperature. You don't control your body temperature by being in a hot house. And your body controls your body temperature. And that is, another aspect of how many calories you might need, because that depends on your heat loss. And but something up here is doing those calculations. It's not you. And infants being fed, nursing babies are not all the same weight, but and they certainly get all the food they could possibly want to eat, because any good mother wants the kid quiet as long as possible. So, and yet there's variation, and yet the variation is getting worse, and the obesity is getting more. So I think we have to. Whoops. I'm gesticulating too much.
I mean, just for me, it's like 700 calories isn't. It would be difficult for me to add 700 calories of clean food to my diet. But if I was drinking soda, or going getting frappuccinos at Starbucks or something, I could probably do it.
Yes, but I don't think you would do it, because I think you would feel uncomfortable. It would not make you feel happy. It would make you feel bloated and sick and disgusted.
So this is really interesting, because I think that some people have more of a tolerance for physical discomfort in the body. And I've noticed this because I have maybe the most sensitive constitution of anybody that I've ever met. Like if I have something, for example, I love coconut milk. And if I drink coconut milk that has a gum or some kind of stabilizer in it, it just puts me out. And anything that has additives in it just...
Like it irritates your guts.
Like it irritates my guts. I'm bloated. I'm uncomfortable. I feel like my mood changes.
Well, yes, there's a huge variation in sensitivity, but there's also probably the one thing that hasn't been studied is what's this wasteful energy capacity. And it's kind of a joke. A lot of women sleep close to their husbands because they produce a lot of warmth. Right? I mean, that's not always in my family. My sister produces heat and her husband is always cold. But there are people like that there is that variation. Well, people who produce a lot of heat have the capacity to waste a lot of energy. And people who are cold all the time,
that's my problem,
probably have less capacity to do that, and therefore are going to be can more easily gain weight when they screw up, when they send false signals to their system. So yeah, we have tremendous variation in that. I mean, it's like our physical capability. Some of us can run marathons. Some of us have been athletic all our lives. Others, trip over their feet and just whatever they try to do, they're not very good at it. We have a wide range of variations, that all of which is normal.
It's a real chicken or egg thing, though, because the people that I know who are, let's say, heavier don't seem to be as sensitive to foods as I am, or as both of us are. And it's hard to say with whether because of that they just kind of eat whatever, but because we're kind of edgy about our gut, like how we're feeling at any given time after we eat, we are really careful about it just out of necessity. You don't really know which comes first.
I think all of this is probably, I mean, we have a lot of variation in us, and we vary in height, we vary in percent fat. Some people are very lean and don't store. I mean, an average woman is 25% fat, an average man about 20. But that's certainly not. There are plenty of variations from that, and there are people with a lot less than that who, no matter what they do, that's what their system is telling them is the right amount of fat for their body. But nobody thinks of it's not something that you're in charge of. And I think that's what's wrong with our thinking. And that's the basis for the bias against obesity and for the blaming of individuals for their obesity. In fact, I'm thinking of writing an article called "Stop the Blame Game," which I'm doing it so slowly it may never get done, but I think it's an important message, and perhaps what you guys are doing is going to be more effective in achieving that than what I am fantasizing that I will do.
It seems to me like you're shifting the blame a little bit, though, because if people avoid these processed foods and like you said, cook at home using minimal ingredients that they can actually track down the provenance of, then maybe they can take control of their weight?
All right. You can control your weight. If you stop eating, you will lose weight.
Yeah, I was just going to
Guaranteed.
say there's this Angus Barbieri
Guaranteed.
guy.
And if you put a stomach tube down and keep pouring stuff in, you will gain weight. So yes, you can override the natural mechanism, but I don't know of anybody who I've ever known who wishes to do either of those two things.
And they don't seem systematic, right? They don't. It doesn't seem like over the last 50 years there's been people just
Right.
putting tubes down their throat, and
No,
that's hard to see.
No. It's happened to people very accidentally, and there's a lot of data showing with weight loss or with attempts at weight loss with dieting to show how ineffective it is, and how much you have to cut in order to actually have any impact, and how the drive to go back to where you were is so strong that 95%, I think it is, some high number of people who successfully lose weight regain it all and then some.
You were saying
So-
earlier, it sounded like you were saying that the damage caused by these compounds that induce reactive oxygen was not reversible.
No, I'm saying we don't know.
Oh, we don't know.
Since we, first of all, we haven't, that's my hypothesis. Nobody else has ever said that. So it is not like it's an accepted concept.
We've talked to a couple. So I don't know if you know the work of Stephanie Seneff. She's at MIT, and she's looking at the effects of glyphosate, and is coming to the conclusion that glyphosate is causing metabolic dysfunction on the level of redox imbalance, which is leading to a lot of these crises.
Redox is in fact the point that I've focused on most heavily, because the redox state, which includes reactive oxygen, of course, is communicated throughout the body. And so a change in redox, and I've shown this in published work, changes the way the cell behaves and controls reactive oxygen production. For example, in a more reduced state, we produce more reactive oxygen. And
for people at home, like redox might, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but it's kind of the electrical balance of the cell, essentially, right? Just to put it in layman's
it's a
terms.
signaling system that tells you exactly what the energy status of every cell is. And obviously, it's important that every cell in the body get its fair share of nutrients in order to do whatever the job of that cell is. And if we didn't have such a communication system, then, the stomach would get lots of stuff, the liver would get even more, and other places, muscle might not get anything at all if there was just enough of the, it would be a stupid system. It wouldn't work. It has to have a communication system. And the brain has to be part of that because it's heavily involved in knowing when you're hungry and knowing when you're stuffed. That signal that you don't want to eat anymore. That signal that something is screwy in this whatever I'm drinking. I don't want any more of this. That's coming due to a signal that theoretically one could identify, study, that's going to your brain and telling you to stop. And so I think the neural system is certainly part of it. And but I think also I think that the redox system is probably the main communication system for the energy status throughout the body.
What is the process by which that gets communicated to the brain? Is it mediated by the thyroid? Is it mediated by hormones? Like, what is the...
So you guys know biochemistry?
More or less, I mean...
We passed somehow in grad school.
Yeah, try us.
Okay, so during metabolism, NAD is used, NADH is produced, and vice versa at a variety of many steps throughout the cell.
And these are
In the
these like
mitoc-
master balance molecules, which the cell can keep track of if it's oxidized or reduced, and it's kind of a teeter-totter. And if you have too much NADH, it goes
Yeah,
into that would be what, oxidized state?
It's like a charge
reduced.
balance, right?
Reduced, yeah. So
It's
NADH is
too much NADH. So what happens is that I'll give the easiest example. You eat something with glucose. It's metabolized through glycolysis. It forms pyruvate, which goes into the mitochondria and is converted to NADH. NADH has electrons that it can donate to the electron transport chain, which the electron transport chain uses to convert ADP to ATP. And it's all part of the system to maintain the ATP ADP ratio, or the energy state of the cell. And there are dozens of enzymes that are using this couple, NAD and NADH, and it's speaking to almost every pathway. The fat oxidation also involves NAD, NADH changes. A lot of fuel metabolism always leads to an increase in NADH in the mitochondria. Okay, so then there are compounds that themselves may not be very important, but they're in equilibrium. So ketone bodies, and beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate are kept in equilibrium according to the NAD-NADH ratio. Lactate and pyruvate, same thing in the cytosol through
and these are
lactate
all
dehydrogenase.
inputs into metabolism. And so basically like the metabolic system runs on the basis of the equilibrium of these compounds, because you need a specific level of lactate to pyruvate in order to drive the citric acid cycle.
No, it's a consequence. It's just so glucose oxidation, glucose metabolism will always lead to pyruvate, and pyruvate can be converted to lactate. The enzyme lactate dehydrogenase interconverts pyruvate and lactate, and which one you have more of or less of depends on the NAD-NADH ratio. So the total amount will be due to the fuel that you consumed, but the ratio will be based on the NADH to NAD ratio. And what makes this a good system is both beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, lactate, and pyruvate are readily transported across all the membranes, and you can measure them in blood. So the blood level of lactate and pyruvate, or the ratio of blood lactate to pyruvate, is about 10. The main source of lactate and pyruvate is muscle, and the intermuscular ratio is 10, about 10. So that cytosolic redox state is communicated to the blood supply. And then that lactate and pyruvate can go into any other cell and also will influence the NAD to NADH, or the ratio. And same thing with beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, which are mitochondrial metabolites. So neither lactate is not used by mitochondria. It's only in the cytosol. Beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate are essentially not used anywhere but in the mitochondria. And they're measured routinely in blood. And the beta A ratio in the blood is usually 1 to 2. The LP is usually 10. And when you eat a meal, and we've done this and published it, or when you infuse glucose, you can measure the blood level of these guys, and they change exactly as you would predict. So what that means is that the liver can metabolize all the glucose, let's say, that came in, produce lactate and pyruvate, but that lactate and pyruvate is going to go to the brain and be able there to interconvert NAD and NADH by using the same enzyme, the same reaction, and also then to provide pyruvate to the brain mitochondria, so that the redox state in the liver or the muscle is the same as it is, or is it's trying to achieve the same thing. So I think that's how that communication system works. And the ROS comes into it because the glutathione and other thioredoxin systems that handle excess peroxide use NADPH, and NADPH is derived from NADH through it, etc. It's a lot of chemistry there. I'm sorry to be throwing this at you, but the point is there is a communication system. I've actually written a review on this, and Redox is a communication system, but it's not designed for normal people to read. It's in lingo, but and I'm afraid I'm not very good at communicating these ideas. I need the help of people like you.
Well, I think that that's the problem with metabolism, is that when you start to get down into the nitty-gritties of it, it immediately turns into this massive biochemistry of these molecules flying around.
I've been very worried as you guys are talking about all of this. People are just absolutely clicking on other videos right now. It's like nobody has the patience for this.
So let's see if we can get a master, like a 30,000-foot view on it. So basically, inside of the cells, there's this charge ratio that emerges from normal metabolism, and then it's communicated to the rest of the body by molecules that are able to diffuse into the blood and then get shunted around to the other cells. Those other cells can use those to balance the electrical state inside of them.
Right.
And so the brain then feeds back onto the body using hormones or using
a variety of signaling systems, probably neurons as well. I haven't, that has not been a focus of my research, and very few people of my colleagues look at things in this sort of way. They mostly are doing molecular biology, which is looking at like 2 or 3 molecules that interact. This is a more systemic approach. And, so how are metabolites in the blood affecting neural transmission? It's a question. And I've not known of anybody who does that.
Hey folks, I apologize for the interruption, but I really need your help. In fact, we can't eat without your help. So please come over to patreon.com and consider supporting our project for just a couple dollars a month. You can come hang out and join our inner circle. We meet together once a week on Sundays and figure out what needs to happen next. It's just a really beautiful community of people who are curious about similar things. And I love seeing everybody every Sunday, and I would love to see you there. So please come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and support what you're listening to.
And so in terms of actually being able to change this, so I accept that there's a metabolic baseline for a person, where there's a set point where there's some percentage of body fat that you maintain. And if you're eating this stuff that's interrupting this balance, it screws that up, and so you throw a spanner in the works, and so your insulin is spiking even if you're not eating glucose, you're causing fat storage, you're leading to obesity. So is the only solution to just eat not processed foods?
Well, we're saying processed food because that's the only thing that has changed since, that correlates with this. The cause has to precede the consequence. So something has to have changed to cause what's happening. And there are a number of things both in our food environment, but also in our air environment that have changed. None of them have been looked at. None. And no one is looking that way. And so I think that we need to recognize that we don't have the answer. And you want the solution, and I want the solution. And I can make some guesses, and I've done it in my own family, and that is to eliminate as much processed food as I can. And it has had a very noticeable effect on metabolic health in my family. It's an N of 1.
Sure.
If 2, 3, whatever. It's not new knowledge. I think it's a hypothesis that needs to be tested. And I think a lot of people who maintain healthy weight are people who eat that way that you're describing, whole foods, natural foods. The reason that, but it is not the advice given by the medical profession. So if you know any people who have been diagnosed with diabetes, ask them what their doctor told them when they made the diagnosis. They told them to stop eating carbs. They told them to stop eating everything that they liked, but they didn't give them any alternatives. And stop buying, I don't know, what do you call those ready-made dinners that are frozen?
The TV dinners?
Frozen pizzas,
Yeah.
dinner, TV dinner.
Stop buying stuff like that and make it from scratch. Well, that isn't the right thing to tell anybody, especially someone who's got, 4 kids and a full-time job. You have to find a way to help people implement a plan that isn't much more work and that tastes just as good. And that's why I wrote a cookbook. That's exactly the reason, because and it's what I've done with patients who my physician colleagues are trying to treat. We've done demonstrations of how you can prepare something delicious like chicken tarragon in 15 minutes. And it's not dried up chicken, which is what the doctor told you to eat. And it's not that you can't have any dessert. There's a delicious peanut butter fudge recipe in there that's made with dark chocolate and peanut butter and no added carbs at all. It takes maybe 5 minutes to melt the chocolate. It'd take you longer to go to the store and buy the junk than it is to make this fudge. So, but I know that because I've been cooking all my life, and I
think
play
that's
around
a
with this
really
stuff.
intimidating step. A lot of people don't know how to cook. A lot of people don't have the equipment. There's a lot of dishwashing that's associated with it, and America doesn't have a deep food culture.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
And so,
and it sounds like it's so difficult. If what people perceive as the instruction to eat healthy food and prepare from scratch kind of things sounds so difficult and time consuming and outside of their realm of experience that it's useless advice. And that's why everyone says, oh, they're not compliant. They're not compliant to doing something that they can't incorporate readily and they don't know how to do. But that can be changed. Is that the solution? No. The real solution is that we should not have anything in our environment or food supply that hasn't been tested and shown to be healthy for people.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree with you. I just think that we wouldn't be able to have a food supply that lasts as long. You go to the store and there's grain that is shelf stable for weeks. You buy a loaf of bread and it just doesn't mold. And you were saying earlier, you make one at home, it's stale by the end of the day, and within 2 or 3 days, it's starting to grow stuff on it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that just creates a totally different way that you have to live if you're gonna actually not eat that stuff, because it's a lot easier to go to the store and get pasta and to get pre-made bread than it is to make that stuff yourself. And so there are significant shifts that people would have to make. And I think that that's a really difficult.
But you don't have to have bread. I mean, this is
people
the point.
love bread, though. I love bread. Who doesn't love
Yeah,
bread?
I know. And I have nothing against bread at all, but I'm saying that if you had a disease that was going to kill you early and harm your unborn child and do also, and you would be willing to make a few sacrifices. And if I could feed you dinners and breakfasts and lunches that were really good but didn't have bread, could you manage that?
Some people can.
think you
mean,
could.
it's actually shocking to me. Like I had a friend who got cancer, and I was kind of explaining some of this stuff, and I could just tell that it was just beyond possibility that this person could stop eating refined carbs. Like they just weren't interested. They'd rather die than stop eating carbs.
And not even that, but I think that there is some of that.
I mean, that happened.
That did happen. And that happened with me too. Like I had a friend who is an ultramarathon runner, and he got cancer. And I was like, he eats sugar all the time. Like he goes to...
A lot of these ultramarathon people do these sugar packets. And
Yeah,
so
look
forth.
at look at sugar. What is that?
Well, it's not like he's mainlining tablespoons of sugar.
More or
He's
less.
No. Even the tablespoon of sugar, where did that come from? Does that look like a plant that you'd grow in your backyard?
Yeah, exactly. And we're driving, we were on a guiding trip in the Grand Canyon, and he stops and he gets a bag of gummy bears, and we're driving and he's just gnashing on these gummy bears. And I'm like, dude, you can't do this. And he's just kind of like, how important could the food be?
I think people have this perception that they wouldn't sell it if it was really toxic to me.
And that's why I'm saying the government can't. Okay. So the changes that are needed are multiple. For one thing, there's nothing wrong with teaching children from first grade on how to, I don't know, grow chickens and feed them every day and collect their eggs, and then how to cook an egg. I mean, in first grade, I think my kids could have easily handled those chores, and they would have a different understanding of where the chicken and where the egg came from. And, and so if that should be part of education, nutrition and health should be part of education from day one. So, and also knowing how to do very basic things. I mean, what's wrong with knowing how long you have to cook a piece of chicken as part of your coursework? Is that less valuable than knowing how to spell chicken? I don't think so.
No, I think you're right.
Chicken's difficult.
So we had a friend visiting recently, and he works at a donut factory. He's the mechanic, and he basically keeps the entire place running. And we were talking about the way that the assembly line works. And it's this closed loop system where they use oil to fry the donuts. And then when that oil is shot, what they do is they pipe it over to a different department and use it as an ingredient in some like cakes that they make. I know. And he's like, it's a zero waste process because the cakes just soak up the oil and we don't have any waste. And it radicalizes me because everybody knows that cooking oil that's been used is highly oxidized, super bad for you, and it just disappears into the production line at a different place.
So I learned something from you, and that's exactly the point. So making the cake from scratch and understanding that what happens, I mean, you can have chemistry in grade 7 or 8 and learn how prolonged heat affects the structure of fats. And you could feed them to your chickens and kill them. And I think that no one would ever, no kid who ever had that experience, I wouldn't do it actually, but if anyone who had that experience would never want to eat that fat again.
But people don't know. You go to the store and you buy the cake and you're like, there's no way that they're putting poison in this.
That's right. So exactly. But there is. And now you've just told me a new way that I never heard of before. But there are so many things of that kind.
Yeah, it must be happening everywhere, right? I mean, I like to do this experiment where I'll take one of my friends who's not a science person to the store and just pluck something randomly off the shelf. And when you look at the list of ingredients, there's only a couple of them on there that are actually food, right? The rest is just like these industrial byproducts and just exact sort of zero waste situation where somebody's selling off, the portion that they don't need, or it's been processed into not being food anymore. It's really stunning just how little food is inside of a lot of these.
I use that in some of my lectures. I have an ice cream product that I think has 47 ingredients in it. And then I highlight those things that are actually might be considered food. And they're the vast minority of ingredients in this ice cream product. And, I make ice cream from scratch. It's really not a lot of work, and it doesn't have very many ingredients. Like
Is this an
4 or 5.
accelerating thing? Like when this seems to have started happening after World War II, where
It
people got
started
really
in
efficient.
the 70s
Okay.
when, well, I think a lot of things happened at the same time. As I said, in all fairness, the ability to maintain long shelf life allowed us to feed starving people
Right.
and transport food to places that didn't have easy access.
And starvation has been
was
radically
a
reduced.
reasonable goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. But also women began to have full-time jobs much more frequently, and they weren't staying home all day to cook. And not that my mother ever did anyway, but or even my grandmother, they never stayed home all day to cook. But there's this sort of fuzzy concept. I think I spend more time cooking than either my mother or grandmother ever did. But it's not a measure. People say it's lip service. They say this is the way it was, and yet there may or may not actually be any evidence for that. But so those two things happened. And then the world became so much smaller. We could travel and, everybody flew everywhere. And, I don't know, maybe if my parents had 10 vacations in their life that involved getting on a plane, that was a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes do that in a year. So, our whole life, everything changed in our lifestyle. And as I said, children don't learn about nutrition. That whole area is completely, and growing things. How do you grow plants? I mean, none of this is considered important knowledge anymore.
It's not easy.
Huh?
Growing plants is not easy. I've learned over the years.
I grew up in New York City, and I felt good I could differentiate between a tree and a bush. So growing plants was not.
I think there's maybe one or two in New York City.
There
There's
were
maybe-
a few, yeah, not many though. And but not everyone is going to do everything. I mean, neither of my daughters cook. They both hate it, but my sons do. So I don't know. I changed sex roles. I don't know how I did it, but the cooks in the family are all male except for me. But it's not taught anymore. It's not an important skill. You just go to the store and buy it. And now you can go play a video game instead of cooking dinner. And I don't think that it's more satisfying to play a video game.
It's easier.
Or watch a movie, huh?
It's easier.
I don't even think that. Once you know how to do it, it's very satisfying to do, some simple things and put a really nice meal on the table. It's wonderful to invite your friends and neighbors to share a meal that you've cooked that they think is wonderful. I don't feel like I think we're a little bit brainwashed into thinking that's hard work. Let the mass producers do it with their cooking fat in the cakes.
I mean, I grew up in a family where cooking was absolutely central. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and so 3 home-cooked meals a day. She never, ever bought processed foods. In Russian, processed foods are called polufabrikаты, which is like partially manufactured, which I think is really a better term than processed, because when you have manufactured as the as the modifier for it, it suddenly gives you the sense of the industrial scale of it. And she was always like, no, that stuff is poison. She had multiple family members that worked at canneries. And so she was like, I think her dad worked at like a jam plant in Siberia at some point, and never, ever, ever ate processed jam because he knew what they would put in it, right? Because it's not the finest fruit that's going in that jam. It's the stuff that's half rotten, moldy.
Precisely.
Just basically garbage that they need to be able to process down. And so There's a sense of that, but again,
I was not so lucky.
I know Shiloh had a
It's the alternatives that aren't promoted also, because like we all know that the PFAS from plastics that are in our water supply, for example, and now all of the tin cans that used to just be tin now are coated with that, with a plasticizer. And my bet is that there are high levels of that particular chemical in every canned thing.
Well, there was a crazy expose in ProPublica maybe about 2 weeks ago now, where there was an interview with one of the scientists at 3M who was put in charge of doing blood analysis for PFAS contamination. And she was doing this, I think, in the 70s and the 80s. And,
Wow.
or maybe 80s. And she ran into this thing where there were no uncontaminated samples that were available to her. At first, they thought that the machines were broken. Her supervisors were like, keep testing, something's wrong.
Right.
And then eventually they got some blood sample from some indigenous tribe in the Arctic Circle. And it was like the first blood sample that she had ever tested that wasn't contaminated. But it was absolutely everywhere. And so obesity is just one aspect of this, because I think that it's also folded into the rise in cancer rates. Like colon cancer has gone up across the world dramatically. Reproductive cancers, prostate cancers,
Especially for young people.
especially for young people. And so I wonder,
Yep.
have you looked at that connection as well, or have you focused mainly on obesity?
Well, my area of expertise is metabolic regulation. And so I have really not, the disease is a consequence and rather than my main focus. But there are so many, I mean, cancer is related to obesity. Obese individuals have certain cancers with much higher frequency. They have cardiovascular disease, they have fatty liver disease, they have kidney failure. You know, the list goes on and on. Almost every part of the body has a detrimental effect associated with obesity. And so understanding what causes obesity may be the cure for many of those things. And I think one of the difficulties is that we're all so different that you're talking about the PFAS. There are, the liver has a system of processing and getting rid of alien unmetabolizable stuff, okay? And some people have a much better capacity to handle that than others. And so that's why maybe, some people handle the toxins reasonably well and others not at all. So
you mentioned air quality briefly. What sort of changes have we seen in the last 50 years with regard to air quality? Is it just proliferation of automobiles, or what else is going on?
Well, there are things, it depends on where you live. But for example, I'm currently living in Aventura, Florida, and I've not seen a mosquito. I wonder what happened. When I lived in Boston, we had lots of mosquitoes, and especially in the summer and especially after, rainfall and damp weather. So somebody told me, I don't know if it's true, that they spray the air from, what kills the mosquitoes may not be so good for me.
Wasn't there
I don't know.
some sort of genetic engineering project to kill the mosquitoes in Florida?
There was a gene drive project to exterminate the mosquitoes that carry, I think, West Nile and Zika, because there's only like certain species that harbor it. And so they figured out a way that they could infect them with either a virus or a bacteria, I don't remember, but it makes them sterile. And so that was the alternative to pesticide spraying. But I mean, for example, like we live in rural Oregon and I go running and I know that they spray the ditches with herbicides. And all of that stuff is just on the surface, and all of the surface water ends up at the river, and we take the drinking water for the city from the river. Like right at the place where, it's deep in the center of town. There's a cabinet manufacturing company there. There's all kinds of industrial plants. And so I know that there's stuff in the water that they're not testing for. And it must
You're
also
right.
be in the air.
Well, and the stuff in the air, you think of the people in Los Angeles who have air quality issues much of the year. What is it that they're breathing? And, things that go in through your lungs can go in to your body. And, we're also eating pesticides and fertilizers, a variety of such things inadvertently. So that's why I don't want to limit it just to things that have intentionally been added to food, because the insecticides, pesticides, and air pollution were not ever intended to be added to your food, but yet they get into your body.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the saddest examples I can think of, we have really bad forest fires out here, and they spray this Phos-Chek stuff everywhere when this happens.
Yeah.
And it's really sad because some sleuth scientists figured out that this was really bad for people a while back, and they actually sued the USDA, I believe it was. And the result was that they got some money, but the only change that happened as a result of it was that they weren't allowed to spray it within 300 either feet or 300 it doesn't really matter, some very small distance from rivers, right? The problem is, if you come out here to Oregon, there's a river at the bottom, like it's all valleys and ridges where we live, right? So you can spray it 300 feet from a river, it's still going in the river, right? And it's really troubling because you go out after these burns and you can see, there's this one place in particular where you see streams running off of the cliffs and there's no plants living around them, right? There's little waterfalls and stuff just dead everywhere.
That's a real good sign.
And right next door to them, there'll be a hole in the rock where there's a natural spring and there's all these plants blooming around it. It's just really, really disturbing. And so it's kind of sad because you think, well, these people went to all this length to prove that this is dangerous. They even did this lawsuit. And then the result of it is just this haphazard, kind of, it should be fine. We'll just stay away from the rivers.
No, this is exactly what's happening all across the board. But again, it's because these issues and these diseases are not important. And, it's in the case of the pollution that you're talking about, there is not a clear association with any particular disease that everybody cares about. In the case of the garbage that I'm concerned about, there's the evidence of a problem is clear cut across the country and getting worse every day and spreading throughout the entire world. And still it's not enough to even go look and see what the real cause is. And that's, the reason why I did the work that I did was not because I thought I could solve the problem, but because I thought I could generate a hypothesis that could easily be tested. And that if anyone thought it was important enough to find out, they would do that. And, I'm still optimistic. That's why I'm talking to you. That somehow we'll be able to communicate that this is a problem that's only getting worse and that can be solved.
So I want to make sure we make it through these myths. So we covered a couple of them. Are there some more salient myths from your recent talk that might be worth mentioning?
Well, I think that I'm trying to. You're making me think of all my myths, and I'm at a complete loss to remember what they all
actually,
are.
I was thinking, can we take a quick stretch break, use the bathroom, and then we can come back and we can land the conversation?
All right, and I'll go get my list of presentations.
Okay,
Perfect.
All right, so we'll see you back in 10 minutes, so 10 after.
Okay, fats are bad. The body needs carbs. Dairy is bad. Wine contains sugar and should be avoided at all costs. You are what you eat. In other words, you're in charge of your body weight. And certain foods can help to burn fat. Those are the myths.
What's that last one about? I haven't heard that one.
It isn't true. nothing helps to, foods do not help to burn fat. If anything, they form it. But it is what you see if you are getting a lot of information. If people think you're interested in dieting and in nutrition, you get sent a lot of junk.
Mm.
And
What kind of things are
so
people suggesting burn fat? Or yeah.
that's, I don't remember.
I know that there's
Honestly.
supplements that get hawked for that. Like there's one that was popular a few years ago, like Garcinia cambogia.
Yeah. An uncoupler could help to burn fat, an uncoupling agent. But, those things are just simply not really allowed anymore in our diet, I don't think.
What do you make of this Ozempic stuff?
Those the GLP-1
Oh,
agonists.
sorry. Okay.
Well, I mean, I don't think you should apologize. It's just we didn't call it that.
I see.
But it's a class of drugs. Wegovy is another one. Ozempic is another one.
Gotcha.
And so nobody really knows how it is that they're causing fat loss yet.
We're pretty sure that what they're, I think the hypothesis that most of my colleagues who are working on that are pursuing is that they're acting as signals that are saying that you've had enough. In other words, there's the normal signal that you both have that allows you to eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full and maintain a normal weight. That what determines what the right weight is for that. And if a false signal, let's say, it causes your body to believe it needs more food in order to be at the right weight or have the right amount of stored fat. And if this then opposes that or goes in the opposite direction of that or deletes that information in some way, then now your body, as long as you're taking this, now your body knows that you're at the wrong weight and it will strive to get to a new weight. And if you look at these drugs, they don't cause weight loss per se. They cause a downward trend that levels off. And if people get to a weight where they want, where they're happy and they're stable, and they want to stop taking it, well, they can't, because as soon as they stop taking it, they go back up to where they used to be. So it's altering effectively the set point. So it's acting on a region of the brain that has not yet been well defined, that has been somehow misled into maintaining the wrong set point and making a correction. And from the data that I've seen, it's actually making a good correction because people don't get too thin. I haven't seen any evidence that anyone gets too thin on these drugs. They get to what we would consider to be a normal weight. Some of them don't get there. Some of them level off at a weight that they are not so happy with, and they want to lose more.
But these things also have crazy side effects, don't they?
Every drug has side effects, and it's a popular press game to make a good story. And I have not seen any data that suggests that there's a general side effect that's very frequent. There are GI side effects, and of course, this is the GLP-1 and GIP, and these are gut hormones, and they are having a gut effect, which is not a big shock. However, my colleagues who prescribe recommend starting at a very low dose and not increase, and instead of going to the desired dose immediately, they start at a very low dose, and then only increasing when those side effects are gone, because those side effects, for the most part, seem to be transient. But you'd have to talk to a practicing physician to get more reliable information. I know a lot of people have taken them and who are very pleased with the results.
Yeah, people seem really happy about it.
Yeah. Yeah, so, because, imagine the frustration of of being considered a bad person, being prejudiced against because of something that may not really be your fault at all, that you don't understand, that nobody does, and now you take a drug and it goes away. Thank God, right? And and now you're allowed back in the human race. People like you again. You can get a job. You can date.
Yeah.
So it's it's a wonderful accident that happened, that they accidentally developed this drug. And yes, it will have side effects.
Sure.
And some people have much more sensitive guts than others. And you talk about you're very sensitive to certain odd things in the food that you eat. Anything that can upset the gut upsets mine. So so that's so I won't even go near it. It's like I do not need to go through that process to find out that yet another drug that has a side effect on the gut affects me. But we're all different, and I had no problems of that sort when I was young and dating and having children, and so it's okay.
Yeah.
Another thing that could be argued has changed in the last 50 years is people seem to be perhaps spending more time sitting at computers. Do you think that there's a physical component to this?
I like that there's a
No.
perhaps in there.
Well, yeah, they didn't have computers 50 years ago.
No, but I'll tell you what, this is another myth.
Okay.
Exercise will make a difference in terms of your weight. Zero. None.
Okay, shocking.
There have been meta-analyses done, and there have been so many studies done where people have been carefully controlled on a diet to lose weight, plus and minus exercise. Zero weight difference. Now, exercise is extremely valuable, but it isn't because of weight. It's for other reasons altogether. And but there is no evidence that being very active impacts your weight. Again, this mechanism that your body has that controls your amount of fat and your amount of weight is going to be the dominant force in terms of regulating your weight. And it won't matter whether you exercise or not.
It probably depends a lot on the type of exercise, right? I mean, if you're doing Olympic weightlifting, those guys are jacked. They're enormous.
Well, right? If you weightlift, you certainly will gain weight.
Yeah.
I just that's gotcha. So not in line with my experience, though. So that's interesting. It might
it's in line with mine, though. Is the terrible thing, right? Whether I exercise or not, stay the same weight.
Yeah, I mean that's true. I think you just don't like eating enough.
I try. It's like, where am I going to get those extra 700 calories at?
Just mainline olive oil.
I do already.
10 tablespoons a day of olive oil.
I'm already on that.
So it's not in your control how much you need to eat and how much you want it. I mean, this is if it weren't centrally controlled, all the animals would be in trouble. Those deer in your forest are not counting calories.
But they're walking
eating when they're hungry. Huh?
But they're walking around all the time and they have a limited supply of food. Like, I do notice that in a bad year where there's not enough food, they get much more lean.
That can happen if there's not enough food. If there isn't enough food, yes. But when there's an abundance of food is what I'm talking about. It doesn't make any difference. They get to the weight that's their normal weight. And if you ever go on safari, you will notice that the lions are lying in the sun. They are the most inactive creatures you've ever seen, except for the few moments when they go chase the gazelles and have their dinner. And the gazelles are hopping by all the time, and they do not bother them. But it's true of every animal. And no matter how much food they have, they don't overeat it. And your experience, that what you're telling me about, is the way we've always been as humans. The way every child is. Your parents put food on your plate, you eat until you're full, and you say, I'm full, I can't eat anymore. And then you can't eat anymore. Maybe you can have one little bite of that cake, but there is not a considerable amount. We do not control it. We control what we eat. And if you don't eat enough protein or enough vitamins and minerals that your body needs to thrive on, you will eat. You can overeat. So if your diet is all, with those gummy bears that this guy was eating, if that's your diet, you'll eat and eat and eat and eat, and you'll get a fat gut. You'll store fat, but you'll still be hungry because your body needs nutrients. It doesn't need a single gummy bear, but it does need certain protein and essential fatty acids. As a matter of fact, all the cells in our body are cordoned off from the blood supply by lipid bilayers. Water would leak into us and blood would leak out if it weren't for those lipids. So there are essential lipids that we need to build those barriers. And if you don't get those, you'll be hungry. But
there is some sort of interesting feedback loop with different foods. Like I notice if I have like a huge bowl of pasta, like I'll eat it past when I'm full. Like it's so delicious, and there's something about in my brain wants to keep eating it even though I know I don't need it. But if I'm eating like a steak or something, I can eat steak, and at some point I'm just kind of good. I won't keep eating it past being hungry.
This is the point, because your internal control mechanisms know that you need the steak and know when you've had enough. You don't need that pasta at all, but you may need some protein, and you're not getting it when you're eating that pasta. So you keep eating because you're missing an essential nutrient. And that's, it's another possibility that people have such unbalanced diets that they have to eat much too much in order to get what they need.
That makes perfect sense.
This is true of children. You've seen pictures of children for whom protein is not available, in Africa, and they have great big bellies. They're fat because they have carbs, but they don't have the protein that they need, and so they overeat it.
What do you think about protein intake in general? Do you go with the 1 pound, 1 gram rule?
What's that rule?
Just per body weight. Sorry, like if you.
Oh no, I think that it's highly variable. I mean, I'm 86, and at my age, I need very little food. I'll have one 8-ounce steak for my husband and I, and might even leave some over. Okay, when we were younger, and the 8-ounce wouldn't have been enough for him. He would have wanted more. And I probably would have eaten 8 ounces. So age is a factor. Activity is a huge factor, and how you're using that is a factor, and also how much heat your body puts out. So this is never measured, but if you're a very hot body and you're putting out a lot of heat, you're wasting. You're consuming calories to do that, and
what controls that? I'm definitely one of those people. I just cook off everything. Is there some master regulator for that, or do you think it's entirely genetically encoded? Is it set up when you're in your childhood?
I don't know what's known about that, to tell you the truth, but I do know that the people who are, people are different, and again, age makes a difference. People who as they get older, become less cold tolerant than they used to be when they were younger. But it's centrally controlled. You don't decide to be hot. You feel what you feel, and I don't even think it's activity. I think it's centrally controlled. That you have a certain amount. If you have plenty of food available, what's the harm in wasting a little and putting out some extra heat? You can err in both directions. And if you're someone who's cold all the time, you always have a sweater on everywhere you go. That's me now. And because the air conditioning in this community is usually, in my view, excessive. So I usually have a sweater.
It's really bad because we're so different. The two of us live in this house, and I would have
Oh.
it 68 degrees all year long if it was up to me, but Nastia would probably have it 80 degrees all year long if it was up to her.
Absolutely.
So we have it, our temperature now is set at 76, and I'm cold some of the time.
Wow.
And we have the same thing. And it's funny. My husband is a warm body, and I've always been cold. My sister is a warm body, and her husband is always cold. And they're always fighting about. They live in LA, and they're always fighting about the thermostat. And he wakes up in the morning, turns the heat on, and she wakes up and turns it off. But yeah, it's programmed. They've always been like that.
That's
We've
really
always
interesting.
been like that. And
And
it's, you didn't decide that. So if we can believe that that is centrally regulated, then you might as well believe that the food is intake, what you need and what you want, is also centrally regulated. It would be a terrible system otherwise.
And so have you seen researchers taking up the data that you've collected and starting to develop it, or?
Not yet. But we just had an article on obesogens. There's a guy called Jerry Heindel who has actually worked for NIH, and he was in charge of funding in the National Institute of Environmental Health that promoted looking into these kinds of things. But he retired, and he's so interested in the subject that he's formed another group and is still working on this. And I think he coined the term, at least I learned it from him, of obesogens. And it started out being these endocrine disrupting chemicals, which, endocrine disrupting means just generating a signal that screws up the way your endocrine hormones respond. And so I think that's obviously one of the things that these obesogens do. But I think we have to get at the base of it. I'd like to know, a simple test so that we can tell. And maybe also that could be applied. I can imagine a way it could be applied to people to find out, for example, if you're somebody who can has a hard time putting on weight because you have this adaptable system that can put out heat whenever you eat too much, then knowing that's useful information. And if you happen to be one that has just the opposite, really very efficient, that's also worth knowing. And there may be ways to treat people who have these two extremes.
I just think that it's so tied into the material industrial systems that we're all subject to that untangling it is really difficult. I pulled up this paper that Jerry wrote in 2022, and they have a couple of pictures or a couple of figures where, one of them is sources of obesogens. Yeah, hold on one second.
All right, let's take a look at it.
Yeah.
And so, it's basically everything from paper products to clothing to drugs to pesticides and makeup and vinyl flooring that's in your house, things that are in plastic bags and plastic bottles. It seems like we live in an environment that is unbelievably complex to untangle in a way that it wasn't, because I always think about the example of Rachel Carson when she wrote Silent Spring.
Right.
And when she wrote Silent Spring, it was definitely difficult to get people to pay attention to the fact that it was all of this. Hold on one second.
Yeah, exactly.
It was very difficult to get people to pay attention to the fact that something was wrong, but at least there was this one thing that she could point to. It's DDT, it's building up in the environment. If we can get rid of DDT, we'll solve this problem. With the obesogens, it just seems like it's everything.
That's right.
And that's kind of a terrifying situation, because how do you solve everything all at once?
Well, you don't have to solve everything all at once. And that is the point, that if you can identify, every one thing that we identify and we show with certainty, like the DDT, that it has an adverse effect on health, it can be removed. But I just read an article, I think, that removing PFAS from our drinking water has been, there was a rule made that this was essential. It's been negated. It's not going to happen.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Like, there's just not enough political will to make it happen because it's there was a really interesting
Yeah.
book that I read called Deep Life. It was by this geologist turned microbiologist. And he was going around the world to all these different caves and trying to figure out where they could find the deepest living organisms. And so he was, down in these 3-mile deep mines in South Africa. And one of the places that he went was Eastern Oregon. And there's this place there called Hanford, where there used to be a nuclear facility. And there was a big risk that because they were burying waste from the nuclear reactor in these unlined pits, that it was going to get into the groundwater and potentially contaminate everything to the west of it.
Right.
And the EPA was kind of like, we can't really look to see what's going to happen or where it is because there's not enough money in the world to remediate it.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the thing that's happening here too, where, for example, glyphosate, we had Stephanie Seneff on to talk about it. And there's country after country that's attempted to ban glyphosate. And they go back on it because there's no pesticide or herbicide that is sufficient to replace glyphosate. And so they continue using it.
Well, France has banned the use of plastic wrapping. And I found that a very encouraging step. If that can be translated into a health benefit, then it would be a motivation. Somebody has to lead the way. One of the things that I've always felt strongly about is that anything that goes into our food supply, any new thing should be tested. Now, they've always had that rule, but when I looked into it in detail, they had to feed it to, I think, mice or rats or something for over a year and determine that it didn't cause weight loss and it didn't cause birth defects and it didn't enhance tumor growth. But if it caused obesity, they didn't have to report it. So I tried to go back and see, because all these dyes, for example, that are in our food supply have been tested in that manner. They don't cause birth defects in mice. And they don't cause weight loss, but did any of them increase body weight? You cannot get the data. Now, in that case, the data was obtained. And I even had a friend of mine who has contacts in Congress pushing to try and get that information. And he said, you can't get it. So since, but at the very least, it should be part of the required testing for anything new that goes into our food supply or into our environment to not only test for birth defects and weight loss and tumor growth. They implant a tumor and they wait to see how fast it grows, I guess. That could be, we could also look at weight gain.
Yeah.
The data are there. We could require it. And, things have to get bad enough so that there's enough of a movement to change it. And, you're kind of non-optimistic, and I agree with you that in the environment that we live in, doesn't look like it's going to happen in my lifetime. But that shouldn't stop you from doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean that's always the hope, right? You have enough people talking about it, and there's a critical mass, and it clicks over.
And that's right. And being among the first people to talk about it, and doing things like what we're doing today, that's in my power to do. Changing it is not. If I were starting over again, I would I don't know what my career would be, but it might have something to do with trying to fix it. I can think of, some really, if I had the time and the manpower, some really cool things to do. And I could test if this redox thing, you could easily measure the redox state in the blood of humans. It's done.
Mhm.
The tests are available. And if we found that somebody was more oxidized, which is finding, by the way, another colleague has shown that people who get cancer and diabetes are more oxidized
Hmm.
according to these parameters than people who don't. So there's another link to this notion. But you could also give those people who are more oxidized something to make them more reduced, and ask if it changed anything. Because if you can show that by doing some simple thing, you can reduce the chances of that's with the beta hydroxybutyrate, this ketone nonsense that people are eating beta hydroxybutyrate in some form or other.
Like just raw
that-
forms of it instead of doing it through diet?
Supplements?
I think they're doing it through some diet supplements. I don't even know if it gets into the blood, but I do know if you add it to a cell, it causes the cell to get more reduced, the mitochondria, and this may then generate the appropriate signal. It's I'm curious to see what happens. I think the reason they're doing it is wrong, but if it works, who cares?
Fair enough.
Interesting. Yeah, it
So-
looks like supplementing with exogenous beta hydroxybutyrate could induce a state of ketosis without actually having to do the ketogenic diet.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of nonsensical, that whole statement. It doesn't make any sense scientifically, but it sounds fine.
Mhm.
But it's part of the couple of beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate that circulates. If beta hydroxybutyrate is higher than acetoacetate, it passes into every other cell and it converts NAD to NADH. So it changes the redox state. And I think that would be my guess at what it's doing
Mhm.
and why, if it works, why it would work.
So
Ketosis is something that happens when you eat fat exclusively, and the brain is able to use ketones when they're high enough instead of glucose as a fuel. But that's how we survive starvation. It is not a useful tool, I don't think, to control body weight.
do you think that it's a decent diet if it's not necessarily for body weight? Like, is there any issue with eating a ketogenic diet exclusively?
No, none whatsoever.
And so,
And that's also why I do it, because the components of a ketogenic diet are less processed in general
by nature,
than the
yeah.
components of a non-ketogenic diet. Because, I mean, ketogenic just means it's the percentage of fat to carbohydrate is higher. And so high fat diet is possible to have it much less processed. There are plenty of, sort of natural fats
Mhm.
that have not been screwed up a lot, even if they add junk to them.
Mhm. So to close, maybe you said that if you were starting over, there was a bunch of things that you would try, that you would really lean on.
Yeah.
What would those things be?
So you can study people in a controlled setting, and we had done a little bit of this with people, giving them carbohydrates, overfeeding them carbohydrates. And the prediction based on my model is that their redox state, their blood circulating redox state, would become more reduced, but they would also produce more ROS, and that scavenging that ROS would change the redox state. Getting rid of that ROS would change the redox state of the circulating thiols. Okay, so they're all linked together. And what we found was that initially, when you overfeed, you get an increased redox state in the blood. And eventually, this translates, but not immediately, into a more oxidized thiol state, because the thiols are working to get rid of the peroxide. And so then I would try. So if that can be generally documented, I would try infusing something like beta hydroxybutyrate, or the opposite, acetoacetate would have the opposite effect, and ask whether or not that alters the circulating redox state, and whether or not we could manipulate hunger and appetite in this manner, and do it on a relatively small scale. And and then it could also lead to the ability to test people. So if I take your blood sample and your thiol redox state is more oxidized, then I would want to find something to give you that would cause it to become more reduced. And it would be the game to play. We already know from work that has been done by a guy called Dean Jones, who has been largely ignored. He's at Emory University, and he has shown that the thiol redox state is more oxidized in diabetes, cancer, and in old age, and with aging. And all of those are associated with these bad foods that we're talking about and excess weight. So there's some reasons to believe that a lot of the pieces to that puzzle have already, exist. Whether they're causally related or not needs to be tested. So I would do that with people. And with chemicals, I would try to put together a library, buy all the chemicals I could find that have gone into our environment, get all the information I could find about, blood levels of any of these things, and set up a screen using a variety of different cells and ask, do any of these things generate ROS? Do any of these things change redox? Do any of these things respond to something else that changes redox, counteracts the effect? And, I think I could get all of that I've just mentioned done in a 5 to 10 year period.
Yeah, I think that the small steps are the best way to go, something bite-sized. So if you could identify some of the really pernicious ones that are messing people up the most, I think that focusing, people have a hard time keeping in mind more than one thing at a time. So
the interesting thing, the reason that Jerry Heindel and I wrote a paper together is because in having discussions about this, he said that the majority of these obesogens have been shown to cause inflammation. And nobody tells you what that means. What's inflammation? You don't turn red, right? That's what inflammation means, turning red. You do not become inflamed. No, you have an increase in redox or an increase in ROS, and a more oxidized thiol redox state. And so there's already evidence that this happens. So doing something that reverses that experimentally, let's say, does it affect appetite? That would be an interesting one too. If you reduce somebody, will they be less hungry? If you oxidize them, chemically, will they want more food? It's not a hard experiment to do.
hopefully we have some young scientists in training in the audience.
There's actually somebody I came across, somebody's building a platform to connect people with ideas for research projects with those that have resources for doing them, people that have labs that have excess capacity. And so I've been thinking about taking the ideas that people have on the podcast and trying to put them on there to see if there's a way of connecting researchers.
Great idea. There are a few really good people who are starting out. There's a young woman whose name I'm not going to remember in Canada who's just started her career, and she's looking at the effect that these so-called obesogens or new additions to our environment have on a variety of cell functions. And apparently the Canadian government is funding her pretty well. So, I think it'll happen a step at a time.
That's very cool.
Nice. Well, I really appreciate your work. This is a cool topic to break open. I feel like we can continue to talk to folks who are getting started on this, and something to keep an eye on.
Translating my scientificese into English is a really important and valuable thing, because so many scientists like me are not good communicators, and without communicating what you know, you haven't done anything. So I appreciate what you're doing. That's why I'm talking to you. The world needs this.
And the feeling is mutual.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving us your time.